This is the Pick Your Poison podcast. I'm your host, Dr. JP, and I'm here to share my passion for poisons in this interactive show. Today, we're going to shake things up a little bit. Your job isn't to save your patient, but to decide if this famous villain was poisoned or not. I hope this will be fun. This episode is part 2, so for more details on the poison, you might want to start with the last episode, Hemorrhage, if you haven't listened to it yet. Want to know what Dictator's autopsy was published on the front page of the newspaper? Why he hated doctors and what that had to do with his death? What leeches were used for in 1950? Listen to find out. Let's go back in time to February 28th, 1953, in Russia, outside of Moscow, the dacha of 74-year-old Joseph Stalin. Was his death due to poison or natural causes? Listen and tell me what you think. That evening, as he often did, Stalin invited several people over for dinner and a movie. These men, his inner circle and himself, were called the Five. They were Nikita Khrushchev, head of the Communist Party in Moscow, Lavrentiy Beria, chief of the secret police, Georgy Malenkov, chairman of the Politburo, and Nikolai Bulganin, minister of defense. The exact details of the events vary between sources, but what follows are the general facts. The men left his house at 4 or 5 a.m. on March 1st. These hours were typical for Stalin, who often went to bed late and didn't wake up until 11 a.m. Stalin's guards became concerned when he didn't arise by the late afternoon. However, they had strict instructions not to disturb him and were afraid to enter his room. At 6:30 p.m., a light came on inside, but nothing else happened. Finally, at 11 p.m., either his housekeeper or a guard summoned the courage to enter. Stalin was on the floor, unresponsive, soaked in urine. He made a few noises, perhaps attempting to speak, then fell completely unconscious. His watch on the ground next to him read 6:30 p.m., suggesting he fell shortly after turning on the light. He was probably laying on the floor for 4.5 hours before anyone discovered him. The guards lifted him onto a couch and called the head of the Ministry of State Security, the predecessor to the KGB. This man wanted nothing to do with the situation and told them to call Beria and Malenkov instead. Beria and Malenkov arrived now around 1 a.m. on February 2nd. After a long debate, they decided to enter Stalin's room, and Malenkov even took off his shoes to prevent them from squeaking. They were so worried about bothering Stalin. Beria glanced at Stalin on the couch and said to the guards, "What are you panicking for? The boss is sound asleep. Let's go, Malenkov," attributing Stalin's symptoms to alcohol he drank the night before. At 7:30 a.m. on March 2nd, Khrushchev arrived and, shocked, called for the doctors. Doctors arrived about an hour later, now 9.5 hours after Stalin. This extremely powerful dictator was found unconscious. Reading this, my first thought was that obviously Stalin was poisoned. He's the powerful leader of a large country, and no one calls a doctor until 9 hours after he's found unconscious. But in fact, there's more to this, a lot more to this. Let's take a step back into the earlier years of Stalin's life to shed light on other factors at play. He was born in Georgia. Yosef Yugashvili, apologies in advance here for my Russian pronunciations. He was born in 1878 and rose to power in the Soviet Union after Lenin's death. Look at any list of the world's worst dictators, and Stalin is on all of them. He's responsible for what's called the Great Terror or the Great Purge, killing millions. By some accounts, he's responsible for the deaths of 10 to 30 million people, including deaths in the Gulag, deportations, forced resettlement, and starvation during famine. And it wasn't just his subjects that were at risk. Stalin frequently purged his inner circle. Indeed, at the time of his death, the 4 men at the dinner were far from immune. There's evidence Stalin was suspicious of Beria, Khrushchev, and Malenkov. Beria had fallen out of Stalin's good graces and was recently demoted. Khrushchev had been publicly rebuked, and Malenkov's increasing power was seen as a threat. It was said of Stalin that no one ever knew if they'd return alive after meeting with him. Stalin not only distrusted doctors, he'd probably killed several of his own physicians. Being a doctor for the rich and powerful is difficult enough under the best of circumstances. Being Stalin's physician was a particularly perilous job. A neurologist who told his assistant that Stalin was, quote, paranoid, died of poisoning the next day. In 1927, a neuropathologist and psychiatrist diagnosed Stalin with paranoia and other neurological issues. He died during a medical conference, supposedly from poisoned canned goods. Another physician who diagnosed Stalin in a bold move with megalomania and a persecution complex was arrested shortly thereafter and executed by a firing squad a few years later. Stalin reportedly had a fear of physicians. Was this due to his well-documented paranoia, or was it a legitimate fear? During Stalin's regime, psychiatry was actually weaponized, with dissenters and dissidents falsely diagnosed with mental illness and locked up in so-called psychiatric hospitals, which were really poor excuses for a prison. In addition, Stalin succeeded Lenin, as I mentioned earlier. How? Well, after Lenin suffered several strokes, becoming incapacitated, Stalin used the opportunity to take over, seizing power. He was probably concerned that somebody might use a medical excuse to do the same to him. Stalin didn't like exercise, including walking. He smoked and ate a heavy diet, so it's no surprise he had cardiovascular disease. Apparently, he drank alcohol only in moderation, though it's unclear what that might have meant by Russian standards in the 1950s. He probably had a heart attack in October 1945 at the end of World War II, as well as several small strokes. He hadn't seen a doctor for at least a year prior to his death. Some say his primary medical advisor at this time was a bodyguard who'd worked as a veterinarian. Stalin treated his hypertension by drinking iodine in water rather than taking medicine. And in fact, at the time when he fell ill, Stalin's own doctors were being tortured in prison. Yes, you heard that correctly. It's known as the doctor's plot, and more on this in a few minutes. Let's talk about what the doctors, when they finally arrived at Stalin's dacha on the morning of March 2nd, found. Stalin was unresponsive with a blood pressure of 190/110, which is quite high. His right arm and leg were paralyzed. He had a positive right-sided Babinski sign. If you stroke the sole of a person's foot, normally their toes curled down. A positive Babinski, also called an upgoing Babinski, is when the toe goes upward instead. So question number 1. These symptoms are most consistent with A, intracranial hemorrhage or bleeding in the brain, B, a stroke, C, myocardial infarction or heart attack, D, gastrointestinal bleeding. The answer is B. These symptoms are consistent with a stroke, and the physicians diagnosed him specifically with a middle cerebral artery stroke. They ordered the application of leeches behind his ears, a cold compress on his head, an enema of milk of magnesia, and the removal of his false teeth. In 1953, let me just remind you. Question number 2. Leeches help with strokes. A, true. B, false. The answer is B, false. Leeches haven't been proven to help strokes in humans, but partial credit for both answers. Hirudin is an anticoagulant derived from leeches, and a few rodent studies suggest it's helpful in reducing ischemia. That said, improving a few rat cells in a petri dish, however, is a far cry from proving that the application of leeches behind somebody's ears is actually treating a stroke. During my research, I was really surprised to find that leech therapy is still popular in Russia today, apparently. It sends a shiver of horror down my spine, to be entirely honest. I guess what a Russian friend's mom once said is true. Americans are too weak for strong medicine. In my case, definitely guilty as charged. Anyway, back to Stalin and the doctors. None of the treatments worked. Stalin's condition worsened. He developed Cheyne-Stokes respiration, a pattern of alternating slow and fast breaths, signifying severe brain pathology. His blood pressure rose as high as 210/120. The physicians also treated him with magnesium to lower his blood pressure, and camphor, strofantin, which is like digoxin, caffeine, and glucose. Descriptions of these events always mention the shaking hands of the doctors examining Stalin. They could barely examine him, in fact. The dentist was so tremulous he dropped Stalin's dentures on the floor. These men were absolutely terrified. Why? Well, this brings us back to the doctor's plot. In 1952, his cardiologist recommended that Stalin resign for health reasons. Shortly thereafter, the doctor was arrested. And a few months later, the Russian newspaper Pravda announced 9, quote, murderer doctors were arrested to stop an alleged terrorist plot to kill high-ranking Soviet leaders. Now, these doctors weren't local practitioners, but really prominent physicians, including the Kremlin's medical director. And of note, all were Jewish. This led to mass paranoia across Russia, with hospitalized patients refusing care and mothers refusing to give their children medicine out of fear that it had been poisoned. At the time of Stalin's illness, as I said earlier, his personal physicians were literally being tortured. Several reported later that interrogators stopped torturing them to instead ask medical questions. One doctor was asked what Cheyne-Stokes respirations were. Another was asked for recommendations for physicians to treat Stalin's condition. This man gave several names, but none were available, as all of the other doctors he recommended were also in prison. Why did Stalin arrest the doctors and induce paranoia about medicine in general? Well, as with much of what happens in Russia, it's not entirely clear, but at the time, 5 huge prisons were under construction in Siberia. And it's believed that Stalin was planning to start another purge, a mass genocide against the Jews, using the false allegations to incite fear and hatred. So, back to the reluctance by Stalin's inner circle to call a doctor. Maybe a guilty party did want to cover up a poisoning, but it's just as likely they were afraid to anger him by calling in a doctor to treat this paranoid hater of doctors. The health and illnesses of political leaders is always fraught with secrecy and cover-ups. As I'm sure you know, the health of Russian leaders is considered a state secret. There's conjecture as to whether or not Vladimir Putin might have undergone cancer treatment. And it's not just Russia. In the United States, there's ongoing speculation about Joe Biden's mental health while he was in office. In 1953, there was an interesting mix of secrecy and details surrounding Stalin's illness. It was kept secret until a public announcement on March 3rd, but afterwards, surprisingly detailed bulletins followed. According to a recently declassified CIA document, the government wanted to avoid any suggestion that Stalin was under the care of the physicians supposedly involved in the murderous doctor's plot. So if the doctors had been called sooner, would Stalin have survived? Well, it's doubtful given what they did do when they arrived. But in truth, at that time in the 1950s, there was little that could be done for a stroke other than give an aspirin. And knowing the subsequent events, aspirin might actually have made it worse. Stalin's condition deteriorated on March 5th. He vomited up blood several times, developed a low heart rate and a low blood pressure. Reportedly, he opened his eyes, gave a, quote, terrible glance, insane or perhaps angry and full of the fear of death, end quote, raised his hand in a strange gesture as if, quote, bringing down a curse. The gesture was incomprehensible and full of menace, end quote. Then he died. The official cause of death was hemorrhagic stroke due to hypertension. Stalin's autopsy results were summarized on the front page of Pravda. There's a great photo of it on Wikipedia if you're interested. The autopsy noted the following: a large hemorrhage in the subcortical areas of the left cerebral hemisphere, hypertrophy of the left ventricle of the heart, numerous hemorrhages in the myocardium, stomach, intestines, and atherosclerotic changes in his blood vessels. Apparently, notation of these GI hemorrhages was missing or buried in the report to the Central Committee, coming to light much later when the autopsy itself was declassified. All right, so these are the general facts of the circumstances surrounding Stalin's death. So now we come to the best part of the story, the toxicology part. Several historians suggested Stalin didn't die of natural causes, but of poisoning. Poisoning rivals and enemies was, and still is, as any listener of this podcast knows, a well-documented method of murder in Russia. It's clear that members of his inner circle were at risk of a purge and perhaps resorted to a means to a quick end. It's time to pick your poison. Question number 3. What poison might have killed Stalin? A. Snake venom. B. Superwarfarin rat poison. C. Warfarin. D. An aspirin overdose. The answer is C. Warfarin. Acute aspirin toxicity results in death from acidosis and altered mental status rather than bleeding. Superwarfarins weren't invented at this time, and Stalin wasn't bitten by a snake. Snake venom is inactivated in the stomach, so you really can't kill somebody that way. It's been postulated by historians and physicians that Stalin was poisoned with warfarin, leading to his death. Arguing for this? Well, the vomiting up blood just before his death and the hemorrhages noted on autopsy. Brain hemorrhage as well as throughout his GI tract. Warfarin is an anticoagulant medicine, also called Coumadin. It thins the blood for people at risk for blood clots, but its major side effect, as with other anticoagulants, is bleeding. Is this warfarin poisoning? Well, let's look closely at some of the details. First, can we believe the autopsy? Who knows? Stalin's brain was removed for study, but it's missing or it no longer exists, so the gross pathology can't be corroborated. Without any other sources, we have to kind of take the autopsy results at face value. Second, what do you think about the delay with the doctors? Was it a cover-up or fear of retribution from a paranoid man who concocted the doctor's plot who was currently literally torturing his physicians? Quick aside, the doctors arrested by Stalin in the doctor's plot were released and exonerated a few weeks after Stalin's death. Did Beria really believe Stalin was asleep on the couch when he came in? Especially when others said the dictator looked horrible and reeked of urine. And then there are a lot of conflicting smaller details as well. Guards variably said Stalin was drunk the night before his death. Others said he drank very little. They said they were never allowed to enter his room, while others said the order not to enter was new the night of his death. And the Russian government itself had reason for a cover-up. First, the inner circle and the heirs apparent to the leadership were in significant danger of a purge, as I mentioned earlier. Second, Stalin was extremely popular, having led the Russians to victory over the Nazis in World War II. He was only the second leader of the Communist Soviet Union following the Bolshevik Revolution. Any suggestion of an untimely death might have resulted in civil unrest. In fact, so many people turned out for his funeral that hundreds were crushed and trampled to death. That said, in my opinion, the evidence against poisoning is stronger. First, the published descriptions of his symptoms are classic, extremely classic, medical school textbook classic for a middle cerebral artery stroke. We see these symptoms every day in the emergency department. There's often some confusion about ischemic and hemorrhagic strokes. When we say strokes, most often we mean ischemia due to blocked blood vessels, in Stalin's case, the middle cerebral artery. It's not uncommon, however, for ischemic strokes to convert to hemorrhagic strokes, meaning in the area of the stroke a few days later, bleeding might happen. And given Stalin's high blood pressure, this is actually a very likely scenario. It's called conversion from an ischemic to a hemorrhagic stroke. Particular note is made by supporters of the poisoning theory of the other hemorrhages, especially those in his gastrointestinal tract. I actually wasn't surprised at all when I read this. GI bleeding is a well-known complication in the ICU due to stress ulcers. Any sick patient can develop gastric hemorrhage, so much so that prophylaxis with medicine like acid blockers is administered to most critically ill patients. And in fact, intracranial disease is itself associated with development of gastric ulcers and bleeding. An additional issue is the timing. Warfarin simply doesn't work that quickly. It would take at least 2 days, if not longer, to cause bleeding. So even if Stalin was poisoned, it wasn't at the dinner party. From my perspective, he suffered the consequences of advancing age, stress, poor diet and exercise, as well as lack of treatment for chronic diseases like hypertension. However, it's a topic of considerable interest and ongoing debate. In 2003, the Library of Congress assembled a roundtable discussion on whether or not the Cold War could have been averted after Stalin's death. The conversation turned to the topic of his death, and interestingly, one of the participants was Sergei Khrushchev, the son of Nikita Khrushchev. So question number 4. Sergei said he believed Stalin was poisoned. A, true. B, false. The answer is B, false. Sergei Khrushchev emphatically stated he didn't think Stalin had been poisoned, noting that Stalin didn't eat any food unless his closest advisors, including his own father, Nikita, and Malenkov, tried the food first. That's how paranoid Stalin was about not just poisoning, but poisoning by those in line for succession. And it's not just debated in the West, but in Russia too. According to news reports in 2024, the Communist Party asked the FSB, the current name of the secret police, to investigate whether Western intelligence services were involved in Stalin's death. That doesn't seem very likely given Stalin's paranoia and the close proximity of his inner circle. It's Beria's name that always comes up as the most likely suspect. It's known he poisoned rivals, and it's reported that he said at the time of Stalin's death, "I took him out." According to some reports, a doctor in the group who performed the autopsy supposedly detected signs of poisoning. 1 month later, this doctor was dead. I'm really glad I never had to practice medicine in the old Soviet Union. Others note that Beria laid off all of Stalin's bodyguards the day after his death, sending them away from Moscow. 2 apparently committed suicide by shooting themselves later. Beria also gave a strange order to remove all furniture and dishes from Stalin's dacha. These things are very suspicious, but on the other hand, Beria's wife noted that his position was even more precarious after Stalin's death than it was before. And in June of 1953, Malenkov and Khrushchev conspired to have Beria arrested. He was later shot in December of 1953. Khrushchev, of course, became the next leader of the Soviet Union. He eventually banished Malenkov to Kazakhstan after a failed coup. Malenkov died of natural causes at the age of 86. Before this podcast, I assumed that Stalin's memory, like Hitler's, was banished as a terrible dictator to the annals of history, but I was shocked to find that he retains popularity with many in Russia. There are reports Putin has a picture of Stalin in his office, and just last month, in 2025, a statue of Stalin was unveiled in Moscow, honoring his construction of the Moscow metro system. The cause of Stalin's death is a fascinating discussion, and I'd love to spend days debating it. In the end, the truth is left to quote history with its flickering lamp, as Winston Churchill said. What do you think? Was the death of one of history's most infamous villains the sequelae of hypertension or a sinister plot? One of the most famous photos of Stalin is at the Yalta Conference in 1945, sitting with Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. Interestingly, all 3 suffered from hypertension and atherosclerosis. So the last question in today's podcast. Churchill and Roosevelt died of what disease? A, myocardial infarction, a heart attack, B, intracranial hemorrhage, C, a stroke, D, gout. Follow the Twitter and Instagram feeds both at PickPoison1 for the answer. Remember, never try anything on this podcast at home or anywhere else. Thanks for listening. It helps if you subscribe, leave reviews, and/or tell your friends. Transcripts are available at pickpoison.com. While I'm a real doctor, this podcast is fictional, meant for entertainment and educational purposes, not medical advice. If you have a medical problem, please see your primary care practitioner. Thank you. Until next time, take care and stay safe.